The grand assembly of galactic leaders gathered in the vast, shimmering chamber, a space that stretched so wide it seemed to swallow everything around it. The floor was a smooth, glowing surface, reflecting the faces of species from across the universe, beings made of light, energy, and substances unknown to human science. The room buzzed with conversation in hundreds of languages, each filled with the kind of arrogance only the most advanced civilizations could afford. At the center, a large podium stood, where the most powerful beings in the galaxy took turns speaking. Today, the topic of discussion was a simple one: the new applications for membership in the Galactic Alliance. Representatives of countless civilizations, from the towering Zircons to the telepathic Lyrians, had their turn to present their credentials. Each of them brought forward impressive feats, worlds they had created, galaxies they had shaped, and technologies that defied the limits of imagination. But then, the hologram flickered, and a name appeared that made even the most stoic of leaders raise their eyebrows: Earth. A species that had, until now, existed on a small, insignificant rock orbiting an unremarkable star. The human delegation, led by Commander Alara Vance, had made their request for membership. Humans who still used outdated technology by galactic standards, who fought wars among themselves, and had only recently figured out how to travel to the moon. The silence that followed was quickly shattered by laughter. The room erupted, the sound echoing off the far walls. The leaders of the galaxy leaned back in their seats, some of them shaking their heads in disbelief. A few even clutched their stomachs, overcome by the absurdity of the request. Humanity? Join us? They're barely out of the Stone Age, scoffed Thrax, a towering, insect-like creature from the planet X-Cipher, his mandibles clicking with amusement. What can they offer us? Asked Alora, a brilliant being of pure energy from the Enora cluster, her voice vibrating with condescension. They still fight wars. They destroy their own environment. They can't even travel to other star systems. The others joined in, their laughter loud and relentless. Even Archivist Zelto, the respected historian from the Orneal galaxy, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had seen many things in his long life, but never anything quite like this. His eyes, ancient and filled with wisdom, flicked over the human's credentials, but he said nothing. He had his doubts, but something gnawed at him, a sense of unease. Was there something the others didn't see? He wasn't sure. Let's get back to the important matters, said Varix, a being from the Andromeda Empire, cutting through the laughter. Humanity will never fit in here. Their technology is primitive, their cultures unstable. We have no need for them. The motion to deny humanity's request was swift, almost unanimous. The decision seemed obvious, but what no one noticed was the small, quiet smile that crossed Commander Alara Vance's face as she stood at the back of the room, watching the mockery unfold. Her eyes flickered to the holo-screen in front of her, where a small image of Earth appeared. It looked so simple, a little blue planet surrounded by nothing but emptiness. But what the galactic leaders didn't understand was that humans had always been underestimated, and that had always been their strength. Alara's calm demeanor didn't match the storm brewing inside her. She had been a soldier, a negotiator, and now a leader. And if there was one thing she had learned, it was that humans had a way of surprising everyone, especially when they were written off as weak. As the laughter finally died down and the motion passed, the room returned to its previous state of pompous self-importance. But in that moment, as the human delegation filed out of the chamber, something changed. The leaders of the galaxy, so certain of their superiority, couldn't have known it yet, but they had just made the most dangerous mistake of their existence. They had underestimated humanity. The chambers of the Galactic Assembly were still echoing with the remnants of the laughter that had greeted humanity's request. As the leaders returned to their discussions, each seemed content with their victory. Humanity had been rejected, without even a second thought. After all, who could take seriously a species so young, so seemingly weak? They had no advanced weapons, no starships capable of deep space travel, and their planet was still recovering from its own mistakes. Yet, just hours later, a small but powerful message arrived, and the atmosphere in the assembly shifted. It was a single transmission from Commander Alara Vance, the human leader who had stood so silently during the mockery. The message was simple, almost too simple. In clear, calm tones, she spoke, "Thank you for your time. We understand your concerns. However, we believe we can offer something of value to the Galactic Assembly. We have something that may interest you. We will bring it before you at the next meeting." There was an awkward silence as the leaders of the galaxy exchanged confused glances. No one knew what to make of it. A species that had just been laughed at was now speaking in calm, measured tones, offering something of value? What could they possibly mean? The message raised more questions than answers, but the most pressing one was, what did humanity have to offer? The following days were filled with speculation and whispers. What was the something Commander Vance had promised? Some believed it was another attempt at a peaceful gesture, perhaps a technology trade or some form of cooperation. Others scoffed, still convinced that humans had nothing worth considering. But all of them agreed on one thing: they would be watching. When the next meeting arrived, the entire assembly had gathered, curious but still dismissive. The great hall was full of the galaxy's elite, each sitting tall, their eyes full of skepticism. Alora Vance stood at the front, unflinching. The human delegation was small, just a handful of ambassadors and engineers. They didn't come with grand gestures or flashy displays. Instead, one of the human engineers stepped forward with a small, nondescript object held carefully in his hands. It looked like nothing more than a simple, polished rock. The leaders shifted uneasily. A rock? Was this the great gift humanity had promised? The engineer placed it gently on the podium, and immediately the assembly's translator system kicked in, offering a stream of data. The object was identified as a mineral from Earth, nothing particularly rare in its raw form. But then, something happened. As the translator system processed the data, the room went silent. A soft whirring sound filled the air as the rock began to change. The object expanded slowly, its surface shifting, pulling apart into delicate, crystalline structures that gleamed with an eerie light. The structure didn't just grow in size, it seemed to rearrange itself. The engineers in the assembly stood, mouths agape, unable to fully comprehend what they were seeing. The object continued to shift, and the data pouring from it was unlike anything they had ever encountered. It was alive. Within moments, the simple rock had transformed into a complex, intricate device, its surface covered in moving geometric patterns. It hummed with a strange energy, radiating heat, but in a controlled, almost unnatural way. The human engineer looked around the room, his face calm, but his eyes were sharp. "This is the first prototype of a device we call a matter synthesizer," he explained. "It can take any form of energy, light, sound, even raw atomic particles, and transform them into usable materials. It's the foundation for building anything, anywhere, instantly." The leaders stared in disbelief. They had seen technologies far beyond this before, of course. They had met species who could manipulate space itself, fold time, and bend matter to their will. But none of those technologies could create, not in the way this human device did. It was a transformative technology capable of creating resources from nothing, or, more accurately, from energy. The room buzzed with nervous energy. The Zircons, with their advanced biological engineering, whispered among themselves, considering how this could change their world. The Lyrians, who prided themselves on their telepathic abilities, exchanged uneasy glances, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Even the powerful Honora seemed to pause, their energy fields crackling with tension. This was beyond anything they had expected. The human engineer continued speaking, his tone confident yet humble. "It is not perfect yet. It still needs refinement. But we can create anything with it. Weapons, food, building materials, fuel. The possibilities are limitless." There was a long silence. Not a single leader dared speak. They were too stunned. This was not just a simple gift. This was a revelation. It was the kind of technology that could change the balance of power in the galaxy, and if misused, it could spell disaster for the entire universe. Some of the leaders looked uncomfortable, the realization dawning on them humanity hadn't just brought a piece of technology, they had brought the potential for a new era. The thought was unsettling. As the device hummed softly, the leaders of the assembly felt a shift in the very air around them. Allura Vance watched them closely, her gaze steady. She had not come to brag. She'd come to show them that humans were more than they seemed. They were innovators, survivors, and builders. If they could not lead with power or strength, they would lead with something far more dangerous: ingenuity. The silence in the room stretched, and for the first time, the leaders of the galaxy realized they had underestimated humanity in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. The true test of humanity had only just begun. Weeks passed since the matter synthesizer had been presented to the Galactic Assembly, and its implications were far-reaching. The device, which humanity had so casually revealed, was now the subject of quiet discussions and anxious debates behind closed doors. No one had expected Earth to bring such a game-changing technology to the table. The very foundation of galactic power, built on centuries of advanced science, seemed to shift beneath the feet of the great leaders. Slowly, the first cracks in the pride of the galaxy's ruling class began to appear. The Zircons, whose ability to alter genetic structures had always been their pride, began to question their own innovations. They had never seen anything like humanity's synthesizer, something so simple, yet so powerful. Could their own advancements be outpaced by a species that had only recently mastered the art of space travel? The thought was uncomfortable, to say the least. Among the Lyrians, a telepathic species known for their control over thought and perception, murmurs began to spread. They had prided themselves on their intellectual superiority, and yet, when it came to creating, shaping, and building, they were utterly helpless against the human technology. The Lyrians had always believed that the mind was the ultimate force in the universe, but the synthesizer had shattered that belief. It was now clear brains alone weren't enough to control everything. The Anora, beings of pure energy who had always seen themselves as the pinnacle of evolution, felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping in doubt. They had the ability to bend the very fabric of space, yet this small device from Earth could create anything they could imagine, and it was capable of doing so on a scale that no Anora power could match. Their pride had always been rooted in their mastery of the cosmic forces, but now they realized they might not be the most powerful after all. Slowly, leaders who had once scoffed at humanity's request for membership began to take notice. They had ignored Earth's potential, dismissing them as primitive and weak. But now, human ingenuity was threatening to undo everything they had built. And it wasn't just technology they had underestimated, it was the humans themselves. News of the synthesizer spread quickly through the galaxy, and in response, other species started to approach Earth, quietly inquiring about possible partnerships. What had once seemed like a foolish dream had now become a powerful reality. Earth was gaining respect, not just from smaller species eager for new technology, but from some of the greatest powers in the galaxy who had once dismissed humanity as insignificant. The Andromeda Empire, for example, a massive ancient civilization with an arsenal of knowledge that stretched back millennia, quietly requested a meeting with human officials. They, too, were curious, not about Earth's military or their capacity for war, but about the potential of their technology. The first small shifts in the balance of power were taking place. The grand leaders of the galaxy, those who had once laughed at the idea of humanity joining their ranks, now found themselves facing a rising threat, not in the form of a military challenge, but as an intellectual and technological one. Even Archivist Zelto, who had been among the few to warn of humanity's potential, had begun to grow concerned. He had seen the rise and fall of many civilizations, but none like humanity. There was something dangerous about their ability to adapt to learn at a rate that far surpassed their contemporaries. It wasn't just the technology that was unsettling. It was the fact that humanity had found a way to push past the limits others had set for themselves. They weren't just building upon existing knowledge, they were creating entirely new ways of thinking and being. At a private meeting, Zelto confided in a fellow historian from the Nebula Reach, an ancient and wise being named Torres. "These humans," Zelto said, his voice full of both awe and concern, "they've done something that no one else has been able to do. They've combined the best of everything: their creativity, their adaptability, and their sheer willpower. I don't think we've truly seen the depths of their capabilities yet." Torres, ever the skeptic, replied, "They're still a young species. They lack the time to master what we have. Give them a few centuries, and their rise will plateau, as all others have. But Zelto wasn't convinced. Perhaps, but have you considered this? What if they don't plateau? The idea hung in the air, heavy with implication. The fact that Zelto, a being who had seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations, was questioning whether humanity would ever stop advancing, was something the galaxy's leaders could not ignore. Word spread quickly that Zelto and other members of the Assembly were growing wary of humanity. The cracks in the pride of the galaxy were widening, and even the most powerful species were beginning to feel uneasy. There was talk of limiting humanity's access to certain galactic technologies, of putting them in their place. But as the leaders gathered to discuss the next steps, they found themselves facing a difficult decision. How could they suppress a species that was so incredibly resourceful? A species that had, in just a short time, created technology that was beginning to rival their own? No one had a good answer. All they could do was wait and watch. But deep down, they knew it wouldn't be long before humanity's innovations would force them to rethink everything. In the days that followed, as the leaders of the galaxy argued among themselves, one thing became increasingly clear: the era of unchecked pride had come to an end. Humanity was no longer a laughingstock, a joke to be dismissed. They were a force to be reckoned with, a new power in the galaxy, one that could no longer be ignored. After weeks of tense debates, the Galactic Assembly, desperate to regain its sense of superiority, finally decided on an idea to prove humanity's place. It wasn't enough to reject Earth with words or mockery. They needed to test humanity. If the humans truly were as advanced as their technology suggested, then they would pass the ultimate test, a grand competition. The event, carefully planned by the Assembly, would measure everything: intelligence, creativity, strategy, adaptability, and most importantly, the strength of will. No species had ever survived the full challenge. It was an old tradition, a rite of passage for those wishing to join the ranks of galactic leadership. The stakes were high, and it was assumed that humanity, like so many others before them, would fail. The competition was designed to be overwhelming. The first challenge involved solving complex, multi-dimensional puzzles geometries that twisted the laws of physics, almost as if the rules of the universe itself were being bent. It was a test of pure mental prowess. The second challenge would take place on a simulated battlefield, a war game that tested strategy, resourcefulness, and the ability to adapt to a rapidly changing environment. The third challenge was a creative one, creating a masterpiece, a piece of art that could stir emotions even in the most emotionless species, something that could reflect the true depth of one's culture. The final challenge was the most daunting of all, a diplomatic trial, where the participants had to mediate a conflict between two alien civilizations that had been at war for centuries. The humans were given little time to prepare. There was no room for mistakes. They were thrust into this competition with no idea of what awaited them. Yet, Commander Elara Vance didn't flinch. She gathered her team, a mix of soldiers, engineers, diplomats, and artists, all handpicked for their skill, their resourcefulness, and their unshakable belief in humanity's potential. They had to succeed, not just for Earth's future, but to show the galaxy that humanity was more than they could ever imagine. The first challenge began, and the human team stepped up to the puzzles. The Zircons, known for their biological manipulation, were already ahead, their mandibles clicking rapidly as they navigated through the shapes with a speed that was nearly impossible for the human eye to follow. But humanity didn't panic. They simply approached the problem differently. Rather than relying on instinct or innate biological traits, the humans used their ability to think outside the box. They asked questions that others had long since stopped asking. They explored angles and possibilities that no one else had considered. As the hours passed, the Zircons began to falter. Their progress slowed. And then, the unexpected happened. The humans solved the puzzle first. There was a collective gasp in the room, and even the most arrogant leaders couldn't hide their shock. How had they done it? They had approached the challenge with a unique combination of teamwork, critical thinking, and raw determination. But that was just the beginning. The second challenge was a war game, a simulated battlefield filled with dangerous, unpredictable elements. The Lyrians, with their vast intelligence and control over minds, were favored to win. Their precision and ability to predict were unmatched. But humanity had something that neither the Zircons nor the Lyrians had: creativity. The human team quickly adapted to the ever-shifting conditions, using unexpected tactics that no one had foreseen. They used psychological warfare not by manipulating minds, but by outsmarting their opponents in ways that felt almost like cheating, though it was perfectly within the rules. By exploiting every advantage, from the terrain to the smallest resources, they overwhelmed the simulation. As the game ended, the Lyrians were left staring in disbelief. Once again, humanity had proven they were not predictable. They were a force that couldn't be easily controlled or understood. The third challenge was an art contest, a task that seemed almost absurd for a species that was still evolving in the eyes of many. How could humans, who had only recently begun to reach for the stars, possibly create something to rival the artistry of the ancient civilizations represented in the assembly? But the humans didn't try to mimic others. Instead, they created from the heart. The masterpiece they unveiled was a holographic painting, a moving piece of art that depicted the vastness of Earth's oceans, the depth of its history, and the promise of its future. The painting was not just beautiful, it was deeply emotional, resonating with a depth that many of the older species found startling. The Anora, beings who could feel only through their energy fields, stood motionless, their powerful forms trembling. The Lyrians, who had once believed they could feel all emotions through their minds, found themselves moved in ways they didn't understand. And the Zircons, who had little use for art, paused in their tracks, something stirring deep within them. Humanity's art was not just a display of technique. It was a reflection of their soul, their dreams, and their potential. Finally, the last challenge, the diplomatic trial. The stakes were higher than ever. A galaxy-spanning war between two empires had been raging for centuries, and no one had ever succeeded in ending it. The two empires were deeply entrenched in their hatred, and their leaders were determined to keep fighting. It seemed like an impossible task, and many expected the human delegation to fail, just as every species before them had failed. But humanity had one advantage: they didn't view problems the way others did. Rather than focusing on who was right or wrong, they focused on understanding. Alara Vance didn't see the two warring empires as enemies. She saw them as people with fears, hopes, and dreams. Her approach was calm, measured, and relentless. She listened. She asked questions. She found common ground. Slowly, the walls of hostility between the two empires began to crumble. It was a breakthrough that no one had ever thought possible. By the end of the trial, the war was officially over, and peace was brokered. The assembly was stunned. The leaders who had once mocked humanity, who had considered them unworthy of galactic membership, were now looking at them in a way they never had before, with respect. The test humanity had been given was supposed to prove their weakness. But instead, it had shown the galaxy just how much they had underestimated the power of human ingenuity. The humans didn't just pass the tests, they redefined what it meant to succeed. The Galactic Assembly had never expected this. The tests they had set for humanity were supposed to prove that humans were nothing more than an ambitious species, young, unrefined, and not ready for galactic membership. They had watched as humanity faced challenge after challenge, each one designed to push the limits of their abilities. The leaders of the galaxy had been confident that the humans would fail, just as others had before them. But now, as the final results of the trials were read aloud in the Grand Hall, a sense of unease washed over the entire assembly. Humanity had not only passed each test, they had dominated them. One by one, they had outsmarted, outlasted, and outperformed the galaxy's oldest and most powerful civilizations. The Zircons, who had once been the undisputed masters of genetic engineering, were forced to admit that they had underestimated Earth's potential. The Lyrians, the intellectual giants, had never anticipated the raw creativity that humans could bring to a problem. Even the Anora, beings of pure energy who could bend space to their will, were left speechless by humanity's adaptability and emotional depth. The final diplomatic victory had sealed the deal. Humanity had brokered peace where others had failed for centuries. The grand challenge that the Assembly had set up as a test to humiliate Earth had instead become a display of their own flaws. As the leaders of the galaxy gathered for the final vote, the mood was tense. There was no denying it anymore. Humanity had proven themselves. The question now was, how could the galaxy's elite, who had laughed at them and dismissed them so easily, move forward? The shame was undeniable. Archivist Zelto, who'd been one of the first to warn the Assembly of humanity's potential, stood silently at the back of the room, watching the proceedings unfold. He had seen this before, an underdog, underestimated, rising to the occasion. But humanity was different. The others had failed because they lacked the essential spark that humans had, a boundless curiosity, a drive to create, and an ability to adapt. He knew that the galaxy's leaders couldn't ignore humanity now. Yet pride ran deep in the Assembly. Pride in their own history, in their vast empires and advanced technologies. The leaders had once believed they held the keys to the future. But now, humanity had thrown that belief into question. The debate began. Some of the leaders argued that humanity should be allowed to join the galactic community. Their achievements, after all, were undeniable. The matter synthesizer alone was a monumental breakthrough and invention that could revolutionize the galaxy's entire economy. Humanity's creativity, diplomatic success, and military adaptability had all been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. Yet, even with these undeniable facts, many leaders hesitated. The Zircons were the first to speak. Their voices, typically sharp and decisive, now trembled with a mix of anger and frustration. They had been the first to mock humanity, the first to dismiss them as a primitive species. Now they were forced to accept that humans had outpaced them. "What have we done?" The Zircons' leader muttered bitterly. "We believed we were superior, and now this species, with nothing but their willpower and imagination, has shattered that belief." The Lyrians were no better. Their pride in their intellectual achievements had always been their greatest strength. But now they were forced to face a species that could think differently, a species that saw solutions where the Lyrians saw only complexity. How did they manage it? One Lyrian leader asked, almost to herself. How did they surpass us when we have centuries of knowledge and experience? And then there was the Anora, the beings of pure energy. They had seen themselves as the ultimate evolution, beings of immeasurable power. Their arrogance had always been justified by their near-immortal existence and their ability to manipulate the very fabric of the universe. Yet now, they had to reckon with the fact that humans, with their physical bodies and their limited lifespans, had created something they could not match. "We have been blind," one of the Anora said quietly, the words almost like a whisper, but heavy with regret. "We focused on power, on control, and forgot that true progress comes from creation and innovation." As the debate raged on, it became clear that the Assembly was divided. Some, like Zelto, spoke in favor of welcoming humanity into the galactic fold. But the pride of the galaxy's leaders ran deep. Their old beliefs about superiority were hard to shake, and the idea of humans rising above them was almost too much to bear. Alara Vance, standing calmly at the front of the hall, had listened to the arguments with a quiet strength. She didn't need to say much. Her presence alone spoke volumes. Her team, composed of the best and brightest humanity had to offer, stood beside her, shoulders squared, eyes full of determination. They had earned this. They had earned their place. Yet, despite humanity's success, the leaders hesitated. The thought of accepting a species that had challenged their pride was almost too much. But as the final vote approached, something shifted. A new realization began to take root in the hearts of the leaders. They could not deny humanity's potential anymore. The galaxy had seen the raw, untapped power of Earth's people, their ingenuity, their resilience, their ability to adapt and innovate. And though it was hard to admit, they knew that the future of the galaxy might not lie in the hands of the oldest empires, but in the hands of the humans who had proved themselves worthy. With a reluctant but undeniable sense of respect, the leaders of the Assembly voted to accept humanity into the galactic community. The decision was met with an uneasy silence, but the regret was clear. They had underestimated humanity, and now they would have to live with the consequences. Humanity had not only earned a seat at the table, they had redefined what it meant to belong. The pride of the galaxy's leaders had crumbled. And though they would never openly admit it, deep down, they knew that humanity had just become the new force to be reckoned with in the galaxy. The assembly would never be the same again.